Good afternoon. Welcome to our next installment in the Conversations from the Front Porch series, Let's Talk Restorative, Experiences of Justice Practices from a Community Lens. Inspired by the Center for Community Engagement's Front Porch gatherings, Conversations from the Front Porch feature intimate, timely, and candid conversations with experts who provide context for Austin's community priorities to inform and inspire collaborative action. Today's conversation features Dr. Lorna and Mrs. Erica Mason Coleman, who will provide insights into their experiences as restorative justice practitioners. The UT Center for Community Engagement invites each panelist to share insights about how they adapt restorative justice practices to account for the unique community and cultural contexts in which they serve, while honoring the particular experiences of Black, Latinx, Asian, and other communities of color. This conversation also recenters Indigenous knowledges and perspectives as foundational to more equitable notions of justice and redress. Ultimately, then, this event engages restorative justice as an applied practice that critically considers how race, geography, history, and culture shape practitioners' experiences. My name is Ashlyn Gray, and I'm a graduate assistant at the Center for Community Engagement. I'm currently pursuing a Master of Social Work and a Master of Public Affairs. This conversation is especially relevant to the field of social work and community engaged work in general, and I'll be mediating this conversation alongside Stephanie Ling, and I'm thankful to be here with our panelists today. So I will pass it off to Stephanie Ling, who's the Director of Equity and Community Advocacy at the Center for Community Engagement.
Thank you, Ashlyn, and good afternoon, everybody out there, and especially to our esteemed guests. Yay, so I am so excited. I'm trying to calm my giddiness down, but I am just thrilled to introduce our guests and, just get into a really important conversation. And especially with two folks that I must say have really, brought the idea of restorative justice and restorative practice to me, both, and it's really kind of impacted how I see that, and I bring it into my own work. So I'm really grateful. All right, so I would first like to introduce Lorna Hermes. She is the project director of Step Up Texas, improving juvenile justice outcomes through trauma-informed and restorative practices training, a project funded by a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice that aims to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in engagement with the juvenile justice system. Step Up provides training and technical support in trauma-informed restorative practices to those working in public school districts, law enforcement, and the judicial system. The project is a partnership between the University of Texas at Austin, Williamson County Juvenile Services, and Bluebonnet Trails Community Services. In addition, Lorna teaches restorative practices in UT's College of Education and as an assistant professor of instruction. Prior to earning her PhD, Lorna led programs to support college access, college success, and dropout prevention. And our next guest is Erica Mason Coleman. She is the founder of Mallory.org. She holds a bachelor's in education and a master's in social service. Her background includes juvenile parole and probation, casework, foster care advocacy, public speaking, classroom instruction, behavior teacher, special populations, and she's a special population department chair, and restorative practitioners coordinator trainer. Erica possesses a unique mix of knowledge, experience, and training. She has facilitated circles and trained educators and district personnel around the state of Texas in restorative practices. She began her restorative journey as part of the TEA rollout of restorative discipline for all education service centers in Texas. Mrs. Erica L. Mason Coleman remains committed to the social movement that is restorative justice in the community and beyond. Wow, yay. So the first thing I'm thinking is, y'all aren't busy enough. You don't have enough going on. You don't have enough titles, expertise. Right. Well, so again, welcome. And we're going to start our conversation off with, if you could just talk to us a little bit about who you are. I mean, we mentioned some of this in your bios, but I'm thinking a few minutes just around, you know, who you are most related to this work, right? And I know that's sometimes not a small order, but I definitely know that there's a reason why we're where we are, right? Everyone has this journey to the work that they do. So if you could share a little bit of that with us, we would be grateful. And who would like to start?
I can start.
Okay, thank you.
I can say that my draw to restorative was intrinsic without my knowledge and permission. My early childhood was actually as a Mennonite, and the Mennonites have had some influence on restorative and peacekeeping. And then I had just like this direct experience with the school to prison pipeline. I'm one of 27 grandchildren, 17 of which are boys, and 11 of those 17 were in prison before graduating high school. And that's my own maternal family. So restorative is a way of being for me. It's not work, it's who I am, and not necessarily what I do. I am a natural nurturer, so it all made sense to me when I arrived, and it goes beyond my realm of knowledge, but it certainly encompasses my heart. It's definitely heart work and not head work.
Thank you.
That was beautiful, Erica, and I agree. When I became introduced to restorative practices, it's something that you have to embody. You have to embrace it and embody it if you're going to do restorative practice work. And it also really resonated with me. I came to restorative practices through a long journey, so I appreciate your question, Stephanie. When I was studying at UT, I ended up studying the school to prison pipeline, and it kind of landed on my lap. So my life has kind of been guided by other forces, I think. And so when I learned and did research on the school to prison pipeline, I also recognized the trauma that that people experience in their personal lives, and also historical trauma that is embedded in the history of our country. And for some folks who have really difficult home lives, you know, there's a compounding of trauma. And that perspective really resonated with me because of my parents' experiences. They were immigrants, but they also experienced war. And so I didn't understand my parents in certain ways, and I didn't understand my relationship with them until I understood intergenerational and historical trauma. And when I came across restorative practices, and restorative practices came to me again, I saw it as a way to help to heal trauma. And whether that be trauma that is experienced in present life or trauma that is inherited through the generations. And so, so that's how I came to restorative practices. I was invited to sit in a restorative circle, and there were maybe 10 people in the circle, and I was maybe number 8 to respond. And I remember the prompt, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to keep it surface. I am not going to go deep with my answer. But by the time the talking piece got to me, I just shared, and there was so much there was so much healing in that sharing, and there was so much healing in being in a space where everybody is valued and respected and given the opportunity to share and be heard, and where everybody gets to hear everyone else. And so after that first experience, I was sold, and I've been incorporating restorative practices into my life, with my family, with my relationships. It's just a way of being, and those relationships have gotten much stronger because of it.
Cool. Thank you. So the first question that I have for you all is about how you define not only, restorative justice, but restorative practice. I know there are folks that will be watching this who are, like I was at one point, a little confused by or not clear on, what's the difference, what is restorative justice versus restorative practice, and even kind of how any of this works. So if you could share like how you define both of those, and then how do you implement that into, I wasn't gonna say your work, but into your life, then we'll say. And Erica, if you could start with you.
Thank you. Restorative justice, as I received it, is defined as a social movement, a philosophy, and a set of practices that seek to address harm in a community. I'm very careful to say address harm in a community. If I state that we're going to repair harm or we're going to reconcile, then that is an evocation of power and control on my part, and assuming that we'll be married to an outcome. I don't know what the outcome will be when we come together. What makes restorative is the fact that we are addressing that harm. And because it's derived from indigenous peoples carried to North American indigenous peoples about 40-ish something years ago, that actually started with a criminal case. So the criminal case became that baseline for the restorative justice. So it came from the criminal justice system, and the practices of indigenous people were adopted, the values were adopted, and someone, I guess, had the nerve, right? The nerve and the foresight to say, let's handle this differently. Let's not use those traditional criminal standards for deciding how we're going to be with each other in this community after this harm. And so when I hear people say restorative practices, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention restorative discipline, which is often attached specifically to schools and school systems. Restorative practice for me is that part. It's the infusion of restorative justice and kind of restorative discipline, in that we have a collective way of understanding that we will choose addressing harm and meaningful accountability over punitive consequences. Facts. Suspensions don't work. Facts. ISS does not work. Expulsions do not change behaviors. But when the community can come together and address those behaviors and have an equitable and peaceful and safe conversation about the behaviors, that's the catalyst for a change in behavior. It's not a fast process. It's certainly not a microwave process. It's a very slow cooker. So those are the main things for me. Restorative justice is a social movement. It is a philosophy. It is a set of practices based on core values, 7 particularly. And it does seek to address harm in a community when it occurs. We know that it will occur. There's no utopia that I know of yet. And so we know that we'll have conflict. Finding those peaceful ways to address it serves us better than those traditional punishments.
Okay. Lorna? I'm sitting here.
Yes, I just would like to build on what Erica has shared. My world is more centered around restorative practices. And
Mhm.
and that is the practices that are utilized, practices and philosophies that are utilized in restorative justice and applied in situations where harm has not happened. And so
Mhm.
restorative practices can be used to build community. And one of the main practices in restorative practices is the community building circle, where participants are seated in the shape of a circle, to signify that we are all equal. There's not one person who has power over the other, even though there is a facilitator of the circle. And restorative practices and the community building circle seeks to build community. And in the school setting, oftentimes kids, when they act out, their behavior is a form of communication. And so when they don't have either a developed vernacular or the confidence or the feeling of safety to be able to communicate what they mean or what they're feeling, sometimes they will get to a point where they act out. And so implementing restorative practices, which allows the space, it allows the facilitator to cultivate a space of safety, of respect. And it allows every participant in the circle, and so in a school space, that will be students, to have the opportunity to be seen and be heard and to see others and hear others. That research has shown that these community building circles, by implementing them, negative behavioral outbursts are reduced, the need for discipline is reduced, and the feeling of school climate and community is increased. So restorative practices takes all of the great things, all of the practices and philosophies that are used in restorative justice, and kind of front loads those practices into education spaces in particular, at least in the world that I work in, to help build community, to give students a proactive way to communicate and feel safe and be heard, and thus can reduce the need for school discipline.
Which is such a big thing, right? It's huge. Just listening to you both, I'm just struck with this idea that for so many students, I could say adults as well, this has never really been their experience, right? To have this safe and thoughtful place for them to express themselves. Have you found that even in this process of doing restorative justice and these practices, that there has been, have you witnessed the shift for students in particular? Like, kind of, has there been like this kind of sense of mistrust, or I don't know if that's making sense, but this kind of progression into kind of feeling comfortable and settled in these practices? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
In my experience, I find that the children are the early adopters.
Okay.
It's the adults that I have to respond with. Ultimately, all the things that we experience in a school setting are truly a result of adult behavior. Whether it's your caretakers or trauma outside the school. And we talk about that trauma and the generational trauma and the inherited trauma. I love when people have those conversations, and it hurts when we don't acknowledge that much of the trauma comes from in the school system. So that pipeline, it starts in school, and the institutionalization starts in school. So children, especially younger children, are very early adopters, right? Because it becomes the way that they know to communicate. It's the adults who participate or who are tasked with understanding and communicating in a different way that is less punitive and is not riddled with bias and power and control, that it requires a lot of unlearning for adults, in my opinion, in my experience.
Mhm. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And I echo that as well. I work with university students who are seeking to either become teachers or to work in nonprofits that serve youth. And I also work with current teachers and administrators. And I find that it takes about 3 times max for someone to sit in a circle to get it and to buy in. I haven't experienced anyone not buying in after they've given it at least 3 times. I remember working with a group of assistant principals who are over discipline in a particular district. And after the first circle, one of the assistant principals said, I don't get this. I don't understand why we need to take time to be vulnerable. And that was not after the first circle. That was at the beginning when I was introducing what restorative practices was. And then I always, have the opportunity for folks to sit in a circle together. And that same assistant principal afterwards said, I know I said I didn't see the value, but now that we experience this, I can see how it's beneficial to hear how other people are doing and to be able to express themselves. And then so I worked with this group for five times. And by the 4th time, I was given homework, and my homework was that they needed to go out and facilitate a circle with anyone, with their own children, with their family, with kids at school, with anybody. And that same person who said, I don't get this, I don't see the value in this, he said, I already facilitated in my ISS class in school suspension. And he's like, the kids loved it. So I think I may have gone off topic a little bit.
No.
But with for me, it's about giving people the opportunity to experience the circle and the power of being in community in that way, because we don't do that in schools traditionally. And as human beings, one of the 7 core assumptions that Erica was talking about, one of the 7 core assumptions is that we as human beings are connected to each other, and we need to connect to each other. And so what I love about the circle is it's a structure that allows us to connect with each other in a way that not just, as a student, I was the person in the back of the room who didn't give eye contact to the teacher because I never wanted to get called on. Like I was really shy. And it was typically the same small handful of students in every one of my classes from, K through 12 through college, who would talk in class. And most folks could get through class with never saying a word. And I was one of those people. With the circle, everyone has the opportunity to be seen and be heard. So the ones who are naturally going to speak, they get to speak, but they also get to hear folks who might naturally not speak. And it meets people where they are, because everybody also has the opportunity to pass if they're not feeling like they want to participate. So that has been my experience with introducing folks to restorative practices, particularly circles.
Great. Well, thank you both. So my next question is really based on a lot of the community organizations that we partner with, and thinking about a lot of the work that they do in their communities, and the ways that restorative practices could benefit them. And so the question is, how does centering community cultures and perspectives inform restorative justice practices? Lorna, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, with the circle, I believe that each person's culture and their experience of community is invited into that circle, right? Naturally, all of us have biases, unconscious and conscious biases. And sometimes those will kick in when we aren't even intending for them to. And so when we give each person the opportunity to speak for themselves, to define themselves, to tell us who they are, then that combats any sort of presumptions that we might have had. And it invites space for that person and the community that they belong to be included in that space. And so I think just the structure and definition of restorative practices already centers individuals and the community and their culture that they embody.
I completely agree. In addition, because there are some ceremonial parts to circle, included in the opening and closing, and then other acts, functioning acts like smudging. Those ceremonial portions of circle can include those cultural adaptations that are relevant to the group. So oftentimes students use music for their openings. I will be honest, I don't know some of the words, most of the words, but it's relevant to them and their culture and their vernacular and all of such. And then there are some Afrocentric ceremonies and some other indigenous ceremonies that people use and they bring to circle, and those are always incorporated in a way that the participants are comfortable.
And that's so important, just thinking about all the ways a lot of our identities are kind of stripped from us, right? And, you know, institutions and of education, corporate America, like so many ways. And yeah, so that's just really important and powerful. So, all right, well, I am going to turn it over to my co-facilitator, Ashlyn, to ask the other questions. And in my culture of call and response, I'll try to be quiet. And that's right, you know, because it's been really a wonderful conversation already. Ashlyn?
Thank you, Stephanie. And so to continue our conversation, my first question is, how is restorative justice practiced within institutional settings that have traditionally caused harm and are continuing to cause harm? Thinking about what we've discussed with the public school system or correctional facilities, and how does its implementation look different in a variety of settings? And Lorna, if you would like to go first.
Oh, I would like to defer to Erica because she has many experiences in multiple settings.
I have learned that implementation can look different amongst people, and it has a variety of factors, one of which being their own personal level of comfort, one of which being that they would like to declare that they are restorative without actually doing the work. So it becomes an issue of checkbox. Like, we're going to say we did these things on paper and for state collected data, but we aren't truly embodying the spirit of restorative and adopting those ceremonies and practices, and most importantly, not adopting the philosophies. So in a criminal justice system, when we consider restorative justice, for example, court diversion, it looks different than the restorative justice participation for restitution, right? In a victim and offender, which I prefer not to use those terms, I usually say the harmed and a person admitting doing the harm. In those settings, they are really there to address that harm and deep dive in. But when the court has decided they're going to do these practices and incorporate a sentence, then that sometimes looks differently. And it sometimes looks different for the participant, whether they are truly being a participant or if they too are just checking the boxes because it's been written out for them. Restorative involves inclusive decision making. So when we come together, it's important that the parties involved be a part of the decision-making process. So I think implementation also varies when we do too much too fast. So in terms of a school setting, like a full district, even a small district of, let's say, 5,000, it's a pretty big undertaking to have 5,000 students plus the staff, plus the community, bus drivers, admin, everybody should be involved in the process because it's the community, all the stakeholders. And when you want to take an undertaking on that, it's better to start small and trickle out and grasp the people. While we say restorative is not for sale, there must be buy-in, right? No one owns it. And when we stair-step the community into the process, it seems to be more received than kind of drinking from a fire hydrant. So that's the closest analogy I can have. We can have a water fountain or we can have fire hydrant.
Thank you.
And just building off of that analogy, one thing that I'm hearing from school districts is, you know, we're coming off of 2 years of a pandemic. And so we have all experienced that, including the teachers and administrators who would be implementing these restorative practices. And so they have so much on their plate already. And sometimes even with the best of ideas and the best of practices, which I think restorative practices is one of the best, because the teachers and administrators are so inundated already, plus they themselves are dealing with what they're dealing with, you know, sometimes the best ideas and the best practices can seem like a stressor. And one more thing, and that can be a barrier to implementation. And so what has been decided in some of the spaces that I'm working in, because it is collective decision making, is to just implement these community building circles among teachers and administrators, and not even ask them to implement with the students yet, but just to implement with the teachers and administrators, to build them up, to give them the opportunity to be heard and to be seen, and to provide this support structure, and then allow them the option to decide if they're going to implement or not. But I think right now, given what everyone has experienced collectively with COVID-19, on top of everything else that we experience in our individual lives, I think it's really important, and that restorative practices can be a tool for healing and rebuilding that community now that we are coming back together.
Absolutely. And as we think about this implementation and in this phase during COVID of all of these things within the school systems, we talked previously about the role of children and youth being early adopters of this, and this could be part of their language of understanding. What are some strengths that children and youth bring to the restorative justice practice, and how could practitioners and adults learn from them?
I can go. For me, the main strength is that they bring themselves, you know, and once they get used to the structure of the circle and understand the purpose of the structure and feel the safety and the community that the circle can build, when they feel free to just express themselves and be themselves, it's such a beautiful thing. It's just a beautiful thing. And it gives permission to, it's kind of like a snowball. It gives permission to everyone else in the circle to also share their truest selves. And it's beautiful to see how we're all unique, but how we're also all connected and similar. And so to me, the strength that the youth can bring to the circle is their truest self. And sometimes they've got these really great ideas that I know I never thought of. And together, these really great ideas emerge. They also are funny and kind to each other. And it's just a beautiful display of humanity. So to me, that's what the youth bring is themselves.
Absolutely. Love. They bring the love. They bring a perspective on values that we sometimes ignore when we're paying bills, that we sometimes ignore when we are trying to manage workplace relationships and personal relationships and navigate through all these things that bog our adult mind down. And the kids just come and they're happy and they're participatory and they just speak from the heart. They honestly do. And it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. I am a firm believer that this should totally be in the elementary setting, right? Because it is building that skill set for just being a good citizen, right? And it allows children to recognize their own voice sometimes. And as a practitioner, I'm always learning because the entire collective is about me working on me. I'm not there to save anyone. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not an administrator in the school environment. And so it's a beautiful thing to just be with them and allow them to just be. It has the most wonderful effect, and it is organically healing for me.
Thank you. This is bringing to mind visions for what the future could be through youth that you're working with in your circles. And my final question in this conversation is, when you dream of a more just future, what comes to mind, and how are current restorative justice practices building that future today? It's a big question to ask.
When I think about a more just future, I must admit that I do think about just us and justice in the way it looks, in the way it has failed so many people, and the way it has marginalized so many people. In one of my groups, I use a stuffed dinosaur as a talking piece, and everything about the circle is intentional and symbolic. But when I introduce Donnie the dinosaur, it's because there are some things that I would like to see be extinct. And certainly one of those things is injustice. And I know that's a tall order. I know it's a tall order. And it takes the work of the community. And in my purview, restorative justice fits in that umbrella because the veins of it reach far into the community. And when the community comes together, that's when the action happens. That's when the movement part of the social movement happens. And again, it is a slow mover. But I see vignettes and beams of light just because of what I've experienced in my community, in communities I've visited, in communities that I have been called to facilitate. There's true healing taking place. And when people feel more whole, then they function that way. And so restorative justice and restorative practices play a part in developing the whole human in all parts of who we are, just balancing oneself. And when we have the opportunity to work on self, then we can present our best self going forward. And again, it just has organic consequences.
Hmm.
Our criminal justice system was designed the way it was designed, and the laws were written the way they were written. And what I say about law is they were written, it's on paper, and we can change them to meet the needs of the people.
Mhm.
All I can say is yes.
I know.
So beautiful, Erica.
Mhm.
The future that I dream of includes circles, community building circles, so that we can build connection with each other and see that we are more alike than we are different. And when harm happens, restorative justice. What I love about all of this is, as Erica has said, you start with self-work. You have to work on yourself. You are the instrument in these restorative circles. And I think that is so important. So to me, a future where we are all connecting in community with each other through community building circles, where when harm is done, no one's perfect. We all make mistakes. We all, whether purposely or not, and most of the time not purposely, we harm each other. And there's got to be a way to repair that and to acknowledge that and find a way forward together without, canceling the other person. And restorative practices, restorative justice gives us a structure to do that, gives us a structure, a philosophy, a practice to do that. So I teach semester-long classes of undergraduates and graduate students, a class called Restorative Practices. And every week we sit in circle together. And of course, those first 3 circles, everyone's like, what are we doing? And how much am I going to share? And what is going on? I need this to graduate, so I guess I'll stay. And by the end, they are facilitating their own circles in our class and out in the community. And their final paper includes a reflection on how they changed and how their experience of circle changed throughout the semester. Right? Most of them did the circle for the very first time during our first week of classes. And then 15 weeks later, 15 circles later, they reflect on what it's like. And so I have accumulated a stack of those reflective essays, and I analyzed them with a colleague of mine. And the themes that we found in their reflection were these. 1, they had increased self-awareness. 2, they had increased empathy. And 3, they had a motivation to continue to connect with people in this way. What more can we ask for? Increased empathy, increased self-awareness, and a motivation to continue to connect with people. And so to me, this is why I love and embrace and practice restorative practices, because it's changed my life. I've seen how it's changed other people's lives. And the change is just like what came up out of the analysis of the students' papers. The change is self-awareness and more empathy, and thus more connection. And to me, that's a beautiful way to move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. And now I'll pass it back to Stephanie as we wrap up our time together.
Thank you, Ashlyn. Yes, this has been wonderful. Thank you all so much. A closing question or a thought is for people who are listening to this and as well are feeling some type of calling or interested in learning more, is there a tip or a resource or something that you both could offer as they take this journey to this restorative, look at there, this restorative journey?
For me, I love the book called Circle Forward. And it is written by Boyes, Watson, and Prentice in 2015. They have an update in 2020. What I love about that book is, one, it goes through the philosophy, it goes through the 7 core assumptions, but the majority of the book is basically lesson plans or scripts for specific circles, for specific scenarios. I think it's a really great resource for educators or anyone who wants to implement circles. My world is education, but circles can be implemented anywhere. I implement them in my family.
Yeah,
Actually, and with friends. Yes, and friends. But it's a big workbook, but it's because the majority of it gives you it. They give you like scripts and lesson plans for facilitating specific circles, and the new version includes scripts for circles to talk about race and to talk about to talk about race. So if there was one book that I recommend, it would be that. Also, there have been grants for restorative practices that have allowed for videos to be made. It's so powerful to be able to see videos of actual circles happening. And so if you just go on YouTube and search for restorative justice or restorative practice or restorative circles, you'll find videos, and to see young people sitting in these circles, it's really powerful.
It is. I agree. I love it, and I incorporate some of the videos into my own training tools, right? Because we want to see it and experience it, and so you know, just to be a learner of circles. You know, one thing I failed to mention is the practice of using affective language. So it's the way we refer to self, and that we don't impose our own thoughts, beliefs, and opinions on other people, and that I identify my feeling attached with behavior. That is an important piece of the community building as well. And I have a participant once who asked me, how can we begin to address harm in a community when we didn't even build community to begin with? And I thought, well, I don't have an answer for that, but thank you for asking, because it makes sense, right? In the school setting, relationships lend to compliance. If we front load our classroom communities and our educational communities with those community building circles, it really is beneficial. The one thing I would advise people to do is just engage the little book series. The little book series can be found with Living Justice Press. And it has, and they are literally little books, not little books, but little, like not many pages. And it has circle processes and has race and restorative justice and education and restorative discipline and restorative teaching tools. There's just a whole series, and they're really phenomenal. And I recommend that people start with book studies as a group and as a collective, and just choose the one that strikes you or that best suits your community. And start there. When you begin to gain that understanding, the circle process as a facilitator comes more easy, in my opinion. And I've been in a lot of circles, and I have found that I've had facilitators who didn't even say that much, right? And then the best circles, because it's the voice of the people, and people are invited to share their truth. But yes, the little book series, and you know, just Google. Google.
Great. Thank you so much. Ashlyn, take us home.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time and sharing your heart work. We know this is part of your life, and we're grateful for this opportunity to learn from you. And to everyone who's watching, thank you for sharing in this time with us. Please stay tuned for future installments in our Conversations from the Front Porch series, as we continue to explore these kinds of topics within the Austin community. So thank you all, and everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.